Hey guys, I have a part 1 on my channel, so I would recommend you guys watch that before you watch this one. Alright, enjoy the video. The Amazing Spider-Man was released in 2012 and was directed by Marc Webb. This movie is the first reboot of Spider-Man, and the story is very similar to the first Raimi movie, except with a different villain. Peter becomes Spider-Man, his uncle dies, he learns to use his powers well, a scientist turns himself into a lizard, and has a plan to turn everyone else into a lizard. So Peter has to save the day. Now, these movies get a lot of crap all over the place, though there have been a lot of people massively defending them recently, and I don't like these movies. But I will say that this movie is not very bad. It's just not very good either. Let's start with the best part of these movies. Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker. Andrew Garfield's like the coolest dude in the world, and he is a really good Peter Parker. And I don't blame any of the problems of these movies on him. Some people don't like him because he's an asshole, and he's not relatable, and he's way too cool and way too damn sexy to be a good Peter Parker. And, like, yeah, he's definitely not nearly as nerdable or relatable as the Peter from the original trilogy, but I don't think that matters too much because he's still relatable and he goes through struggle, which are the main elements that you need for a Spider-Man character to work. So what if he's sexy and cool? That doesn't automatically make him unlikable or immune to any problems. And I think the Spider-Man brought in more of that snarky, laid-back charisma that is also very essential to the character, and that Tobey Maguire's interpretation kind of lacked. And Andrew Garfield is just so magnetic in the role, and you can tell how much this character means to him. So I don't care what anyone says, I love Andrew, and he's a great Peter Parker, and by far the best part of these movies.
Pretending you were running this company?
Sorry! My Prada's at the cleaners! Along with my hoodie and my fuck you flip-flops, you pretentious douchebag!
And also, he has a rare window poster in his room, which automatically makes me think that he has good taste. Also, I do like Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy quite a bit in these movies. Just like Garfield, she's an incredibly likable actress, and I think their chemistry in this movie works pretty well. I don't think it's the greatest romance in a movie ever, like some people do, but I do think it works pretty well, and a major improvement than that of Peter and MJ in the Raimi films. And I don't know, there really isn't anything terrible in this movie, but there's just so little that stands out either. First off, the movie is so much more generic and bland than the originals. The cinematography is bland and always so dimly lit, which is something that personally always bothers me in movies. The score is adequate, but really forgettable, especially compared to that magnificent score by Danny Elfman, which, truth be told, I don't really blame it for, because, come on, how can you even live up to that? And the action scenes are mostly pretty forgettable and lacking any of the creativity of the action scenes in Spider-Man 2, or even 1 and 3. The action in Spider-Man 1 and 3 may have not always been great, but it did still leave an impact. I do like the scene where Spider-Man saves the kid because I really like the way it shows Peter Parker's character and how he truly is willing to help out everyone despite sometimes putting himself in danger. But other than that, the action here is pretty lame and forgettable and takes away all of that comic book personality and creativity that the Raimi movies had with their action scenes. And just even comparing the scene where Peter gets bit by the spider. In Spider-Man 1, you get to see the spider slowly emerge in the frame and crawl down on Peter. And then the camera zooms in right when the spider bites Peter. In The Amazing Spider-Man, the spider just appears on Peter's back and bites him, and then Peter's reaction is shown. It just shows the creative vision of the Raimi films and the bland studio-produced vision of these movies. I also did not love the way they handled the Uncle Ben arc in this movie. Uncle Ben is kind of cranky in this movie, and I just much prefer the way he was in the originals, where he was pretty much a saint. And the speech he gave to Peter was so much better there than it was handled in here. And also, the way he dies is just pretty stupid to me. The robber drops his gun right in front of Uncle Ben, and then Uncle Ben runs for the gun and gets shot. Listen, I usually hate when people pick apart small details in movies, but this is just a pretty dumb scene, and it's important as well. He didn't do a sacrifice like he did in Spider-Man, and seriously, what the hell did you think was gonna happen? The more helpful thing to do was just call the police. It's not a big deal, the scene gets the job done, I'm just goofing around, but to me, the entire arc felt less impactful than it felt in the Raimi movies. And my biggest flaw with this movie is that the villain, the Lizard. I find Lizard to be an extremely underwhelming villain. His motivation is so completely lost and underdeveloped. He wants to turn everyone in the city into a lizard. And why? No reason. I recall a few scenes where he talks about humans needing to go in the next step of evolution, but that's basically it. There's no personal motivation to anything he's doing, and Green Goblin also did not really have a clear motivation either, but at least he's an engaging character. He's a really sweet man who's just fully taken control of by this, what the hell is it? Oh, gas. And you got scenes where he's trying to fight off that power and struggle with the psychotic energy that he has. He's also the very close father of Peter's best friend, so it adds personal stakes to the story. And also, Green Goblin is really cool and scary, but the Lizard is completely one-dimensional and has absolutely no character or personal stakes in the movie. Dr. Connors has some relationship with Peter's dad, and he has a broken limb, but it doesn't go anywhere. And then after, he becomes the Lizard, and he's just pretty much of a soulless killing machine. And a boring-ass killing machine at that. Nothing he ever does is fun or interesting in any way. Even his design is just really lame. And somehow he's the best villain in the 4 Amazing Spider-Man villains. So overall, this movie has 2 really likable leads and really nothing awful about it, but at the same time, it's very forgettable and it just has very little things that stuck to me. Give it an acceptable 5 out of 10. Time to get angry. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released in 2014 and was directed by Marc Webb again. This movie is usually considered to be the absolute lowest point in Spider-Man's filmography. People really hated this movie, so much so that a 3rd Amazing Spider-Man movie got cancelled. Just like the Star Wars prequels, it has got its fans who claim it's misunderstood, but the majority of people still think it's awful, and I totally agree with those people. In this movie, Peter Parker is going through relationship problems with Gwen Stacy because her late father told Peter not to get Gwen involved in Spider-Man business right before he died. So Peter both wants to get with her, but is also ashamed to. He also tries to figure out the mystery of what happened with his dead parents. At the same time, a complete loser named Max Dillon gets recognized by Spider-Man, so he starts thinking Spider-Man is his best friend. And when Spider-Man forgets his name, he becomes Electro and evil and wants to destroy the city. Peter's lifelong friend Harry Osborn discovers that they're going to die soon, so he asks for Peter to give him Spider-Man's blood, but Spider-Man says no to him, so he goes insane and turns into the Green Goblin. Right off the bat, this movie falls victim to what I like to call Spider-Man 3 syndrome, where there are too many plots happening at the same time, and all of them are very poorly developed. You got Peter and Gwen having relationship issues. You got Peter trying to figure out what the hell happened to his parents. You got Electro turning insane and begins to want to destroy the city. And you got Harry Osborn getting the disease and turning into this monstrosity. And you got freaking Rhino running around and being a dipshit for like 2 scenes. And as much as I criticized Spider-Man 3 in the last video, and I still think it sucks, at least Spider-Man 3 is entertaining, and it doesn't really take itself too seriously. That movie can get so absurd at times that it kind of becomes funny. But this movie is completely dull and miserable, and it treats itself like this big, epic, mature drama, and that makes it even more of a miserable experience. So let's examine every plot in this movie. First off, you have Peter and Gwen's relationship drama. Now, as you know, one of my favorite aspects of the first Amazing Spider-Man was the relationship between Gwen and Peter. I thought Gwen was a pretty likable character, and the relationship between her and Peter was pretty natural and enjoyable. In this movie, I'm kind of mixed on them. Emma Stone is still really good, and her chemistry with Garfield is still pretty spot on. And I do really like the way they handled her death. Gwen's father warned Peter not to put Gwen in danger, but Peter can't resist dating her, which then leads to Gwen being in danger and dying, and it's Peter's fault. This is an important part of Peter Parker's story. Just like with Uncle Ben, his choices were the result of a loved one's death. Grief and responsibility are an important part of Spider-Man's character, and I thought that this movie did a pretty good job with it, until the ending. When Gwen dies, Peter becomes sad and stops being Spider-Man, which is a great idea. But it only lasts for a few minutes, and then immediately after, he fights the stupid-ass Rhino again. Now, because there's no sequel, this would have been a very depressing ending. But this movie already anticipates that there will be a sequel later many times, so just let Peter deal with his turmoil for some time. In Spider-Man 2, Peter quits being Spider-Man for a good chunk of the movie, so when he does come back to the job, it feels triumphant and satisfying. But here, he quits being Spider-Man for like 10 minutes, so when he comes back, I don't care. But still, aside from the end, I do respect the way they treated his arc. But I dislike the way their relationship is handled. I don't know, I just couldn't at all connect to the way their relationship played out. I thought their relationship changes way too suddenly. Their relationship doesn't get as much screen time because of the three other subplots in the movie. And they break up and get together like 6 different times. Why the hell would you do this? If you want an interesting relationship, make these two break up once and see how they react to that. But no, they break up and come together like a billion times, and each time it feels completely unimpactful to the story. I can't take these two that seriously when their relationship is completely inconsistent and gives me a headache. If you do, I'm really happy for you, and I'm glad you can connect to a relationship that I can't. But for me personally, well, I sort of like the arc Peter goes through. The relationship didn't really work all that well, sorry. But they are honestly not even close to as bad as some of the other stuff that I'll be talking about. Then you got the subplot with Peter trying to find out the mystery of his parents, which literally should have not been in the movie at all and completely goes against a very key aspect to his character. Spider-Man's parents are not important to the character of Spider-Man. They never are brought up in the originals, and it's perfect. You don't need to know anything about his parents because they aren't the important mentors to Peter. Uncle Ben and Aunt May are, so you should just focus on them. And fine, even with the fact that Peter's parents are completely unnecessary to his character, this plotline is even worse because of the fact that it goes absolutely nowhere and doesn't affect the rest of the plot whatsoever. And not only that, you find out that Peter actually was secretly destined to be Spider-Man, and that he was the only one that could have been Spider-Man, and there was some secret underground train that only Peter could access or some crap. I don't remember. Now, the reason I dislike this is because one of the best parts about Spider-Man is the fact that he is a regular kid without anything special about him, and that anyone in the world could be in his shoes. That's what makes him more relatable than, say, Thor or Iron Man. Anyone could have gotten these powers, and the fact that the movie makes Peter Parker destined to be Spider-Man, and that there was some family involvement with him being Spider-Man is just stupid, and it ruins a very essential aspect to his character. Electro in the movie is a complete joke. I honestly have absolutely no idea why anybody calls him a good villain. Just look at his design. This isn't threatening, this is straight up embarrassing. They had a great design for him in the comics. He had this green suit with a cool lightning bolt headband, but in this movie, they make him look like a blue alien. What was the purpose of this? It looks terrible, and I'm so glad that he actually looks like Electro in No Way Home. His character and motivation are just so stupid and poorly developed. Max Dillon is this socially awkward loser who then gets some recognition from Spider-Man, and Spider-Man says something like, "You're a somebody," and then he starts believing that Spider-Man is his best friend, and he falls into a pool of electric eels and turns into whatever the hell this is, and then he goes and causes a ruckus at Times Square, and then Spider-Man forgets his name and he turns evil. I mean, do I even need to begin to explain how completely ridiculous this is? And then he just disappears for half the movie, and he comes back and he has an action scene with Spider-Man and he explodes. That's his entire character. His design is horrendous, his motivation is utterly bonkers, and I mean, he's just so poorly developed. This guy went from delusional and misunderstood to basically just an evil robot in very little time. And once he becomes this evil robot, they do practically nothing with his character. And not to mention the fact that he's just really lame. Time he's on screen, he doesn't make me excited or scared in a good way. He just makes me feel really uncomfortable. And finally, you got the subplot with Harry Osborn. Yay. So first of all, Harry Osborn is introduced in the middle of the movie, out of nowhere, and the movie wants you to believe that he and Peter have been best friends since they were children. And it's the stupidest thing ever. Harry is never mentioned in the last movie or in the beginning of this movie, and you expect to believe that these two were the best of friends? For Harry's arc to feel tragic, you need him to be in a close relationship with Peter. In the Raimi films, Harry was introduced in one of the very first scenes, and you see his relationship with Peter throughout the films. It takes him 3 movies to become evil, so when he does, you do kind of care. Now, I'm not saying Harry has the greatest character arc in film history or anything, but it looks like Zuko's arc when compared to how they developed this Harry. He comes into the movie in the middle of nowhere. He has like one scene where he and Peter are being friendly, and then he turns insane for the rest of the movie. Just like with Electro, his actions completely come out of nowhere and are really poorly developed. Also, his motivation is pretty stupid. The first time you see him, his father tells him that he died because of some family curse and that Harry is gonna die soon. So Harry wants Spider-Man's blood to save himself, and Spider-Man says no, which causes him to become the Green Goblin. This motivation is kind of stupid because Harry thinks that Spider-Man can self-heal, but that's simply not true. But Peter never bothers to mention that to Harry or explain why giving him his blood is dangerous. So this whole conflict could have been potentially avoided if Peter just told Harry why he's not going to give him his blood. And most importantly, Harry in this movie is just really lame and boring. He has none of the charm or intimidating presence that the Green Goblin had in Spider-Man 1. He's a dull, petty brat, and his design, just like Electro's, is completely horrendous. I mean, just look at this. Overall, Harry was a complete disaster. He was horribly developed and completely lame. He was clearly mainly in the movie to set up something in the next movie that never happened because this movie sucked. In general, this movie adds in a lot of things that are completely unnecessary to the movie just so they can appear in the next movie. For example, Rhino literally serves no purpose to the story other than to set up some stuff in the next movie. And changing the story in the sake of setting up the next movie is one of the worst crime a blockbuster can commit, because you never know if the next movie is going to happen or not. The MCU does this pretty well, where they add little details that set the next movie up, but they aren't big things that change the story all too much. But in this movie, I have a feeling that it influenced a lot of the way the movie was told. And the big thing that separates this movie from Spider-Man 3 is that Spider-Man 3 is entertaining, and it had some of the charm from the first movie. This movie is so bloated, boring, and miserable. I was waiting for the movie to end, like, after the 40-minute mark, and the movie is 2 hours and 20 minutes long. Every character in this movie is unlikable besides Peter and Aunt May, and practically every scene is really dull and soulless. I am also not a fan of the cinematography and score. The cinematography has this plastic and artificial feel to it, and it's just a style I personally dislike. I'll acknowledge that this is not really the movie's fault. I just can't get behind this fake-looking aesthetic. To me, it makes the movie even feel more corporately produced and soulless. And the score for this movie, while usually just average, can get really weirdly implemented sometimes, mainly with Electro's theme. It goes for both this trap sound and this weird, mysterious jazz sound, and they have random whispers playing in the mix, and none of these sounds work too well for a villain theme, in my opinion, and they're all thrown together, which I simply think sounds bad. I don't think it's a horrible score or anything, and Hans Zimmer is still a legend, and he composed my favorite score of all time. So I'm not by any means criticizing him as a composer. Also, they played the Blue Danube while Electro was getting electrocuted in this movie, which I find to be kind of hilarious. Now, I do have a few things that I think are done pretty well in this movie, mainly with some of the directing choices. I really like the way they filmed the Spider-Man swinging scenes. I like how each swing has a lot of weight to it, and some of the shots are very creative, like this one, for example. I even like the slow-mo and how it's implemented into the movie. And I usually don't like slow-mo, but I thought they did it pretty well with the way Spider-Man moves. I also really like the way they filmed Gwen Stacy's death. I like how they zoom into Spider-Man's eyelid, and I really like the slow motion on the web, and that final moment where she hits the floor was chilling. Andrew Garfield was still great, especially his reaction to Gwen's death. What a powerful performance. He truly deserved a better movie. Overall, though, while there are a few good aspects, they do not save the movie. This still is a dull, poorly written, incredibly unenjoyable movie. The story is an overstuffed mess, the villains are embarrassingly written and completely unengaging, and the pacing makes the movie feel like it never ends. If you like this movie, great for you. But honestly, I cannot imagine enjoying this movie. I'm tired of talking about it. 3 out of 10. Let's move on to our boy Tom Holland. Spider-Man Homecoming was released in 2017 and was directed by John Watts. This is the second reboot of Spider-Man, and this time it's connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe for the first time. And this movie does go in a much different direction than Spider-Man or The Amazing Spider-Man, and I think most people really enjoy this movie, though there are some that aren't fans. Personally, I think it's pretty rad. The story is actually pretty loose. After working with the Avengers, Peter really wants to live out his life as Spider-Man and do big, helpful things for the world. But due to his youth and experience, Tony, aka Iron Man, tries guarding him from doing bigger things and wants him to stick to being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And you basically watch Peter trying to balance out high school life and Spider-Man life. Meanwhile, a man named Adrian Toomes builds and sells dangerous weapons after a partnership between Tony Stark and the US government shuts him down, and Peter goes on a secret mission to stop him. Now, right off the back, I want to say that this movie was such a breath of fresh air after The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It was kind of like the feeling I got while watching The Force Awakens after the Star Wars prequels, except this movie's better than The Force Awakens. No more unlikable characters, overabundance of plots, terrible pacing, or forced and overdramatic scenes. This movie is really fun, likable, and extremely easy to enjoy. Just as always, let's start by talking about our boy Peter Parker, who so far was the only part that I have consistently liked about all of these movies, except for Spider-Man 3, I guess. And I love Holland's Peter in this movie. He actually looks like a high schooler for once, and I just think he captures the youthful energy of Peter much better than the other two. I don't know, I think he's just really natural in the role. I like how he's able to balance out being goofy, awkward, and charming at the same time, because it fits the character very well. I love the opening where he records the events of Civil War on this really shitty video camera. I love the countless amount of mistakes he makes. I love how he does the Batman voice when he confronts Donald Glover. I love how he records videos of him cosplaying as an Avenger. These small, goofy, and quirky moments are what makes Peter so likable in this trilogy. Like I said before, this movie is very different from The Amazing Spider-Man or Spider-Man. This is not an origin story. Uncle Ben is not in the movie at all, and Peter has already had his powers for quite some time. Some people dislike these new changes to the movie, and if you do, that's fine, but I just can't see why. People don't like that Uncle Ben is not in the movie, but I don't really think it's that big of a deal. I think Uncle Ben is not necessarily essential to Peter as a character. The idea of responsibility is. We just had 2 movies with Uncle Ben's death in it in the last 15 years. So why do we need to see it be done again? There are other ways for Peter to learn responsibility. And I think he learns responsibility a lot in this movie. Peter gets his suit taken away because of his actions. He fails to make it in time to the competition, and he doesn't get the girl in the end, because that's the way it works when you're Spider-Man. But despite all of these things, Peter still perseveres, and he keeps on doing the right thing. If that's not responsibility, then I don't know what is. Also, a lot of people make fun of Tony Stark being Peter's mentor in this movie, and they say he's a really bad replacement for Uncle Ben. And I agree that Tony Stark is a terrible replacement for Uncle Ben. But the movie doesn't treat him like a replacement for Uncle Ben. The two serve a completely different purpose in the story. Uncle Ben's a kind-hearted man whose tragedy is the reason Peter does good. Tony Stark is a superhero who has control over Peter's superhero life, and he basically guides him on how to be a good superhero. But he's also kind of a jackass, and Peter doesn't listen to him that often. The two have completely different positions in the story, and I don't see why people write Stark off as a replacement for Uncle Ben. Now, personally, I'm pretty indifferent to Tony's inclusion in this movie. If he appeared a bit more in the movie, it would have been annoying, I agree, but as he is now, I think he works fine. I don't think he takes away from Peter's character. He serves more as a connection to the rest of the MCU. And also, even if he doesn't do much, Tony Stark is always a lot of fun to see because RDJ is just so great in the role. So, overall, while I would have minded him not being in the movie, I don't think he's a bad addition either. Next, let's talk about this movie's tone and how it nails it. This movie has a laid-back, small-scale comedic tone. Now, I'm not saying that I want every Spider-Man movie to be more laid-back and unambitious, but I do like that there is one. In the Raimi and Webb films, once Peter gets his powers, he automatically starts doing a lot of big, dangerous things. But in here, Peter does pretty small things, or should I say, friendly neighborhood things, because in these universes, there are no other heroes. All of the conflict relies on Peter. But in this universe, there are a lot of stronger heroes out there, so it makes sense that Peter sticks to smaller things. But none of this matters if the writing in the movie is not good. And luckily, the writing in this movie is really strong. This movie is really funny. The writing and comedic timing in this movie is probably the best of any Spider-Man, only maybe topped by Spider-Verse, but only maybe. The jokes in this movie are both really clever and also very natural. The jokes aren't just random one-liners that come out of nowhere. The humor mostly stems from the dialogue and the situations, and in my opinion, that's the best type of humor. This is also a movie where Peter actually spends time in high school, because, like I said before, Tom Holland actually looks like a high schooler. If you saw Tobey Maguire be in high school for too long, you would have probably got freaked out a little bit. And the high school shenanigans and characters are great. This isn't cringy, over-dramatic Twilight High School. This is the funny, clever Ferris Bueller's Day Off High School. The dialogue actually feels like stuff a high schooler would say. I really like Ned, aka the CEO of sex. I love the fact that Peter gets a best friend who isn't some emo bitch who turns into a psychopath. He's a perfect example of a lovable loser, and I think his addition to the story fits really well. And the chemistry between Tom and Jacob is one of the reasons the movie works so well. If the two didn't have good chemistry, I think the movie would be worse. But these two are just so much fun to watch. I also like how Flash Thompson is an accurate depiction on how a jerk in the modern day works. Classic dumb jock bullies don't really exist in this day and age, at least in not New York City. So it's really cool to see somebody that fits this time period. In general, the high school stuff in this movie works way better than it should. The villain in this movie, the Vulture, played by Michael Keaton, is really damn good. The conflict he goes through is very realistic and an interesting conflict. He gets completely screwed by the government, and all of the illegal and dangerous things he does is for the sake of supporting his family. He also doesn't try to kill Peter, but he will if he gets in the way. All of this is a compelling way to write a villain. But because he is sympathetic doesn't mean he isn't threatening. Which leads me to talk about the car ride scene, which is one of the best scenes in the movie, in all of the Spider-Man movies, along with the train scene from Spider-Man 2, the leap of faith scene from Into the Spider-Verse, and the dance scene from Spider-Man 3. Nah, I'm just joking about that one. Kind of. In this scene, Peter and the audience find out that Vulture is Liz's dad, and Vulture slowly finds out that Peter is Spider-Man. Now, this scene is excellent for a lot of reasons. First off, the acting in this scene is great. Michael Keaton is a really damn good actor, and the way he's able to smoothly transition from extremely charismatic to really scary is very impressive. I love his line delivery and the facial expression he makes. They truly capture the tension that you are supposed to feel while watching the scene. I also love how this scene both builds on the hero and the villain. While watching this scene, you understand more about who this character is. You see that he is just a working man trying to support his family. Not only is this twist surprising, but it also adds more depth to the character. When Peter first walks into the house and sees who opens the door, the shock on his face is the same as ours, but we slowly understand more about his character. And I already talked about how Peter learns about responsibility, and this video is becoming long enough, so I'm not going to repeat myself. Even the cinematography in this scene is rather interesting. For the most part, the cinematography in this film is pretty bland and basic, and I'll get into that more in the next video, but this scene actually does some creative things with the lighting and the framing. Overall, I don't really have many issues with the movie. It's not a masterpiece or anything, but it's just a really rock-solid and enjoyable flick. The writing's very strong, the characters are super likable, the comedy's really funny, and the villain is one of the best in the franchise. I would honestly recommend this to anybody, whether you're a superhero fan or not, and I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. See you in part 3, where I'll be covering the other two MCU movies as well as Into the Spider-Verse. Bye!